I was just about to introduce the why we are talking about supply chain resilience on this panel, because this year's conference is a lot about the supply chain, and why is it that we actually talk about. This is probably because the supply chain structure was largely driven by the imperative to reduce cost and improve efficiency for a long time. And by prioritizing those, some weaknesses and vulnerabilities have emerged in times of unexpected events. So has also exposed the fragility in modern global supply chains, and culminating in an unprecedented shortage of semiconductor across backbone industries, completely distorted raw material markets. So at this point, we haven't even spoken about the green and digital transition, which are already reshaping the world. Like 94% of German companies say they cannot survive without the import of digital products or services. So in view of all these health, environmental, geopolitical, economic forces at play, there's very good reason, I think, to rethink the role and understanding of supply chains, especially in terms of their resilience. And this is what we're going to do on this panel. So I will introduce those that I can already see here on the screen that we'll discuss with us today. Happy to have you here, Michael Vetter, General Michael Vetter, Lieutenant General. Michael Vetter is the head of the Cyber and Information Technology Department and Chief Information Officer at the Federal Ministry of Defense in Berlin. Before that, you were in a couple of in various levels in staff, such as Air Transport Command, Air Force Support Command, and in various assignments in the Federal Ministry of Defense. I also welcome Wilfried Karl, the president of ZITiS, the Central Office for Information Technology in the security area. So ZITiS is the cross-sectional service provider for federal security authorities and an important player in the security architecture. So it operates in the fields of digital forensics, telecommunications surveillance, cryptologic analysis, and big data processing. So before you became the president of ZITiS, you are already entrusted with various tasks within the Technical Intelligence Division at the Federal Intelligence Service, BND. Welcome on this panel. We also, and now I have to check again, and I ask for a hint of the regie. We have, I continue with Professor Dr. Michaela Geierhos. She is Professor of Data Science at the Code Research Institute and the Institute for Data Security at the Faculty of Computer Science. And your research focuses on the interface between computational linguistics and computer science. And in your daily work, you deal with practical problems in machine language processing within concrete industry-related application scenarios. So we will hear a little about the technical challenges that arise in day-to-day work. And now I also see our next panelist, Evert Dudok. He's Executive Vice President of Connected Intelligence at Airbus Defence and Space since 2014. You're a member of the Airbus Defence and Space Executive Committee, and your long career began in the aerospace, defence and security industries as a development engineer. So you've got also a lot of insight into the technical challenges in creating resilient supply chains. And we have, last but not least, André Loesekrug-Pietri, President of JEDI, the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Welcome on the panel. You held leadership positions in various fields like private equity, government, industry, and as an entrepreneur. And you know very well about all the different factors that might influence the supply chain politics that companies might have. So I'm happy to have you all on the panel. And we jump right in. And at first, I would like to ask each of you, what does supply chain resilience actually mean in practice? Is it all about being prepared for any type of unexpected events, or is it more than that? Does it go beyond that? So maybe we start with Michael Vetter.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ulrike. Apart from showing my impressive CV, I was also the supply chain manager of the Bundeswehr before I transitioned into cyberspace when I was the commanding general of the Bundeswehr Logistics Center. So supply chain resilience sounds familiar to me. It is pretty much about being prepared, and it's pretty much about planning ahead. When you started the introduction into the panel, you managed the reduction of cost, the improvement in efficiency. For the military, this was never the sole purpose. We always had to prepare for the worst. We always had to plan our supply chains so that it will also function when the enemy is interfering with us. So supply chain robustness basically isn't something totally new for us. I guess the important part now in the 21st century is that we have the tools, especially the digital tools, to build the digital twin for our supply chains, to increase the transparency within our supply chains, to identify the risks, to identify the focal points that might not work well when we see unexpected things happening, and to better mitigate those risks via digital supporting tools. For our IT systems and the IT in our weapon systems, it's a even more complex undertaking to get transparency into our supply chain, which go down to the semiconductor level, who is producing what are the IT elements in our weapon systems, how can we make sure that they are trustworthy. So we see a huge amount of problems coming from the IT world with regard to our supply chains. In a nutshell, for the military, supply chain resilience was always a must. It's about being prepared. It's about being able to mitigate risks, and digital tools will improve our ability to better manage our supply chains and to better prepare for unexpected events to happen. I will leave it there and see what the others have in common.
So, and we continue with Wilfried Karl. Do you agree?
Yes, of course, somehow. Supply chain resilience for me is pretty much the same. I'm not caring about the defense sector. My task is caring about the interior security sector. You mentioned it already, capabilities for police and intelligence services. And I think a main issue when we talk about supply chain resilience is we talk about this when we lose, for example, the one vendor we are using because of a crisis, because we were cut off from this source, for example, because of export regulations changing. So I think supply chain resilience is something we should care about. Supply chain diversity. So to mitigate this risk of being cut off by our supply chain because it's only a single source we are relying on. This is, I think, the most important thing, to try to do everything to ensure more diversity. And I think we can do a lot more in Europe. We are a big market. Even if policing and intelligence is a niche market, but together in Europe, we still are a big market, and we can introduce more and better standards or regulations to ensure supply chain diversity, and even regulations to, for example, make sure that some of the supply chains end or begin within Europe, where we face less risk of crisis that may us cut off from these sources.
Mm-hmm. Evert, from an Airbus perspective, what is or when is your your supply chain resilient, or is it resilient enough yet?
Thank you, Susanne. Let's be clear. Airbus it has such a complex supply chain, and if Airbus wants to produce planes or military goods, supply chain is key, and so it goes hand in hand for us. And I take Wilfried, Karl. Of course, we would like to avoid single sources, but once in a while, maybe on certain topics like engines and things like that, you have very, very limited sources. And when I look also at the title, pandemic and climate change, if I look at pandemic, how it impacted Airbus, I don't need to tell you how it impacted our supply chain, because if we don't buy from those people, then they have, let's say, industrial weakness and commercial weaknesses. So making it sustainable, even across pandemic, was a real challenge, and we are quite through it now. It feels like it, but we're not that sure yet. And if I also look at what it means, the new regulations on climate from the EU, there will be a completely new environment where, for example, hydrogen or other energy sources will need to be developed. So there's lots of things happening, and having an ecosystem that supports the Airbus business and that supply chain and all that is surrounding is essential. So absolutely, making it sustainable. Double sourcing, triple sourcing is one opportunity, but then if I look at a topic like making Airbus sustainable is also about safety, and everything being more and more digital. Susanne, we all love it, but do we have trustworthy information, or is it fake news? And I don't need to tell you that may be still not a problem if you have that in the cabin of your plane, but if you have it in the cockpit, you're really in trouble. And then this whole topic about, let's say, cyber risk, let's say the digital environment, and what all of this means, and getting our supply chain also digitally resilient, aware, maybe independent, sustainable. This is major challenges, and I really look forward to the discussions on this. There's lots to be done. We are on a good road, but definitely it's a long road.
Quite a few very interesting aspects, and now I would like to ask Professor Geierhos, what from your point of view, what is a resilient supply chain?
From the scientific point of view, I think a good supply chain resilience should have three aspects. First, we have to talk about a more comprehensive definition of what is a risk. So we have to tackle several risk categories. We have to talk about the supplier reputation, the location, the geopolitical situation, and so on. But from a technology view, of course, we have different possibilities to trigger these chains and to build robust supply chain resilience with technology enablement. So we have the possibility to use AI technologies. The supply chain leaders want to have end-to-end resiliency platforms, which leverages these big data and AI capabilities, which we haven't had 10 years ago before. So I think we have to face several challenges in the supply chain, and even we have seen the vulnerabilities of a complex global supply chain. We need more flexibility in these supply chains, and if we enroll the same technologies for each supply chain and the participants in the supply chains, we are more like to be attacked, and we have more problems in our technology chains if we go now to digitalization. So I think we have lots of things to do on the technology view. There's lots of things possible which we can include in our chains, but as the colleague from Airbus already mentioned, they are all complex, and we are in an interconnected world, and the flexibility is not so easy due to politics, due to legal constraints, and so on. And I think we have lots of things to do in this context.
So, and now I would like to hear from André.
Hi, Susanne. Hello, everybody. Good to be on this panel. In order to avoid a long speech and have more discussion, just a couple of points. First, I think when we talk supply chain resilience, we need to see that as a video and not as a picture. Because the risk is if we see it as a picture, obviously, we will obviously always looking at the past and be like we have been in these past months and years, so often taken by surprise. So we need to develop this anticipation. Easier said than done, but I just give an example, which is currently the way we use these conferences online. The fact that we will move to a digital or hybrid world in our connection took a lot by surprise, and those who prepared for that, who had already the resilience plans in their companies, in their organizations, in their also security organizations, were much better prepared and had less. So this foresight capability, I think, is a major point. The second thing is the forces at work. I mean, let's face it, in a lot of industrial supply chains, we have increasingly fragmentation happening because of geopolitical issues that the professor just mentioned. We have increasingly companies that don't want to be stuck between the fight between China and the US, just to name this one, and to begin to supply China for China and US for US and probably Europe for Europe. And this has massive consequences, obviously, in the way we are designing supply chains. The third point, which always struck me, is are we using enough technology to actually understand the weaknesses and the weak parts? And I mean, Evert knows that much better than I do, but look at what airliners are doing for predictive maintenance. We have supply chains that are often impossible to understand for the human brain. So are we using enough AI to predict where are the weaknesses? And I'm sure the general will have the same experience with these very complex things. The little salt or the little grain of sand can disrupt the whole mechanism. So probably that's another point that could be discussed. I mean, climate and supply chains, that's maybe my fourth, I have 5 points, don't worry, it's probably an opportunity also to rethink. We have probably gone too far in the purely economic approach of supply chains. And we begin to realize that when you take, I give a very mundane example, electric cars, they have a great carbon footprint. But if you take the footprint of the battery that you need to ship from China with today, I mean, not today anymore, but a year ago, the prices for containers were very, very cheap. If you'd had the whole climate emission pattern, it was actually not as good. So maybe the climate urgent crisis is an opportunity to rethink supply chains and have really a calculation, and that's also a work for economists, a great how can we calculate almost real time the real risks, but also the carbon footprint of a very complex supply chain. Makes no sense to import t-shirts at €5, and probably an opportunity for the Europeans to reshore not everything, but part of our industrial processes. And last but not least, that's probably a call for policymakers, is are we doing enough impact assessment? And again, here a call to the experience from the military. We have the experience of, the military has the experience of these fast experience sharing. As soon as you have a mission, then you do this quickly. We don't do that enough. We have a lot of ex ante assessments, and 2 or 3 years later, we have ex post assessments, and we all know that it's often too late and then too costly to correct. How can we put into our systems, and especially in government systems, this permanent assessment, which does not mean short-termism, but to permanently have a clear view of exactly where we stand? I know it's a rethinking of organization structures, much more agility, much more speed, but probably an important factor, and happy to discuss.
So thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me again. I'm sorry, I hadn't got a resilient internet line here, I must admit. I was already on my mobile connection, and so suddenly my mobile phone thought it was enough. So sorry for this. But we heard quite a few really important aspects already, I think. So maybe you already said so, Evert. You have so many different, or the supply chain is very complex, and I think Michaela said that as well. It's should we actually talk more about the supply chain network or ecosystem? Is it actually still a chain, or?
Yeah, it's very much so, Susanne. What is completely different from the past is, you had maybe 2 engine manufacturers, or you had 2 or 4 providers of I don't know, onboard facilities. The topic now is everything has become digital. The chairs, everything has become digital. So it has a complete new element to each of the supplies, which is great if it works, but it creates vulnerabilities that needs to be managed. And this is the new element. And the topic that was mentioned by André, this topic about anticipation, looking at impact assessments. What happens if through the Wi-Fi connections or the connections on board the plane, information that was not supposed to go to the cockpit comes to the cockpit because somebody is really very intelligent in hacking the systems? And this kind of vulnerabilities, how do you handle that? I also pick up the point of the general, Michaela, where it is clear that this topic about cyber and cyber resilience, we always have to keep tracking what's ongoing, because again, even the best impact assessments and things like that, there's no things like cybersecurity. We need to be very, very much aware of that. And this is a complete new thinking. And yes, there is a supply chain, as you well say, but they are now all interconnected in a sense digitally that was not happening before. And that's great if it works well. We all know how painful it is if it doesn't work. And welcome to the club, Susanne. If you don't have good connectivity, that's not helpful in these days. But the topic, it's great if it works. The problem comes if somebody wants to make abuse of it, and how do we keep that under control? So the topic about this digitalization, the cyber, what I would say, resilience of each of the products that we use, this whole chain has been given a complete new dimension that needs to be managed, and that's the challenge, in all honesty.
And maybe I clearly see that although we have a lot of advantages through the digitization of these supply processes, we also created a whole lot of new challenges and weaknesses where we could be attacked. So are there digital tools? Michaela mentioned like artificial intelligence, for example, do we have digital tools that actually allow us to create that resilience that we need within these new digitalized supply networks? Maybe Michaela first and then André.
Yes, we have several tools, but we haven't enlarged, or we haven't deployed them to such a level that we can support a whole supply network. So in a small scenario, it works, but what we don't have are, for example, open standards for the secure exchange of information between all entities and entities, persons, companies, which I mean involved in such a supply network or supply ecosystem. I think we have seen it, the impact of China's lockdown and its dominance in the key areas of manufacturing. We have seen the problem that there's not enough flexibility to shift to another supplier because there are contracts, there are other things which hinder often companies to be flexible in their supply chain. And even another aspect is predictive analytics, predictive maintenance, that we can foresee what could happen. Where are several bottlenecks in our systems? And even if we roll out a fully digitalized AI-driven supply chain, the problem will still be if there is a bottleneck and it is found by a hacker or somebody who wants to attack it, it works for all. It's like a domino effect. And that's a problem we have also to think about. So if we use AI, and AI is data-driven, is learning from lots of data, we have to establish principles to make these models created by the artificial intelligence in so robust and debiased that we can share them within this network without giving private information to our partners or our other participants in the supply chain.
Thank you. André, do you like, what helps in your view?
No, and I think the general will have also interesting points, but I think what was just said is very important, because if you run this weak link analysis, obviously that can be also turned against you, because it's a great way to identify the weaknesses. So here too, I see that Heike Reiler is listening to us. The point of homomorphic encryption. There are technical tools that will allow us to use this big data analytics, but hopefully by avoiding reverse engineering to individual information, which could then be weaponized. That's point number one. Point number two, there's obviously a question of fragmentation. And I think in particular in the European context, where I would like to know, here it goes beyond my competence, but this topic of solar winds was really a surprise for many people, that actually an unknown supplier, I mean, to most of us, was so critical. It's a little bit when you do a forensic of disinformation. You have the impression that there are many sources, but at the end, actually, there are only one or two sources that are spreading through the network. And this is the same kind of situation. Are we well equipped in Europe to have a clear understanding in the case of attacks, who is actually potentially affected? And I think the fragmentation here plays against that. So it's also a call for probably more integration on the single digital market. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, maybe I, as Wilfried, Karl, your organization looks into all these tools as well, and trying to develop those that can be helpful for the police and the intelligence forces. What's your view on this? What is helpful in creating resilience? What might also create new risks?
Well, I like what André said before, when he said we should dynamically assess the risks of supply chains and other issues. I think that's key to what we should care of in the future. When I think of developing these tools, I also see a global market. And we have to decide whether we would like to take the risk of using tools from a global market, products from a global market. I think we shouldn't cut ourselves off from the innovative potential of a global market. On the other side, some of the capabilities needed by police and intelligence are so crucial, so essential, and sometimes also risky, that we should have a closer look. Is there something that we better do by ourselves in order to have it in any case at hand, even if there is a crisis? And you mentioned cyber attacks. I think attributing cyber attacks is, for example, one of the core capabilities of a state to be able to act in a crisis. And there we really should weigh the benefits and the risks. Is it good to be dependent on a global supply chain here, or should we better do it on our own? Don't get me wrong. I'm not about deglobalization or backhauling everything to Germany. I think this is unrealistic, even backhauling it to the EU. Artificial intelligence was mentioned now a few times. If you look at the patent applications for artificial intelligence, there are many more outside Europe than there are inside Europe. So this is an indicator for the future market that we will have to use. And this is part of my task here at ZITiS. Things that are very critical doing by our own, but on the other hand, look at the global market and find ways to be able to use products from the global market in a sovereign way. Digital sovereignty doesn't mean that we have to build everything by our own. This wouldn't be possible. But we have to have ways of dealing with that risks and ways of examining products that we have to use from a global market. I think that's the best way to deal with that in the future. And therefore, we have to build up capabilities.
Michael Vetter, you mentioned also the identifying risks as one aspect of creating resilience. Do you, with respect to the digital tools that are there to be used, maybe also to secure the supply chain, but also to build it up as a digital supply chain, what are your main concerns with the military background?
Thank you. I would like, first of all, to come back to this issue of risks. Evert discussed, I would say, the technical, logistical risks we have on our platforms, obsolescences, vendor management. How do we keep, for example, in the German example, a tornado jet, which is about 40 years old, flying for the next 10 years to go until we get a replacement. So those risks are challenging, but I guess we have the technical tools to tackle them, also the digital tools, digital twins, predictive analytics, etc. However, when it comes to supply chain safety, and we also have this climate change issue in the topic of our panel, we have far more diverse risks that we have to analyze and assess with possible impact on our supply chains and our systems. And just to mention a few, we have physical risks. One container ship is stuck in the Suez Canal, and the global supply chains are disrupted for a couple of weeks. A tsunami, or look in Germany now with the flooding situation, this is also hampering supply chains to support people, to bring them electricity, water, and heating. We have political risks. A coup in a state, Myanmar, is China still a reliable partner? Those political risks also can affect our supply chains. Do we have the instruments, I just mentioned the strategic compass by the European Union, to assess those risks? How far can we assess them? We have ethical risks. Is it ethical to buy goods from country XYZ? How do we assess this? Which might be a problem for industry. If you say, hey, you have, let's say, North Korean equipment in your weapon system, not very likely, but just to give an example, are you still able to sell your products if you have a North Korean supplier? And there are, of course, cyber risks. I guess we we are developing instruments and we are agile and innovative enough to find instruments to assess all those risks and put it into an equation and then say, okay, where are the levers to improve the robustness and resilience of our supply chains? Where is the need for political action, for government action? I guess André pointed out quite rightly, we have to become more agile and innovative also on the political level to tackle those decisions. And Michaela also pointed out the technical tools, the AI tools that we have to develop in this whole dimension of risks that we are facing in order to become more predictive and to become more, or to develop the foresight that André mentioned quite rightly in his introductory point. So I guess it's a lot more than just technical risks. We shouldn't put it down to just technology because there's huge endeavor really to secure our supply chains, to make them more resilient, to take the climate change issues into account, and also to take the increasing cyber risks that Wilfried Karl mentioned into account and react to this, or become even more proactive in this field. Thank you.
So it seems we actually, all these different risk methodologies that we know, like from IT security, we also know them from data protection nowadays and others. We probably have to bring them together to create one integrated risk assessment and also the foresight processes that you mentioned before, André. But having said do you think for example, these geopolitical tensions that we see, they're a risk that's also quite hard to assess, I suppose, for the individual company who has to deal with the supply chain processes. Will that cause more fragmentation? I mean, you mentioned fragmentation between the different industry players, maybe, and the different tires. But will that also lead to a more like regional supply chains, or what is your view on that, André?
I mean, let's look what is happening right now. I think the cost of maritime transportation has been multiplied by 10, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, this will probably go down again, but I think a lot of companies are watching, and they for them resilience becomes more important than cost, especially in a world where there is less and less this labor cost advantage, because if you add labor cost and risk of disruption, actually China is, to take China as an example, is less attractive as it used to be 15 or 20 years ago, which is a great opportunity for us Europeans. It does not, and then look at what's happening, be it in the western part of China or the semiconductor issue. A lot of companies, are now entangled in situations that are happening over them, where they have their corporate responsibility. But so I think we will see a really, not going back from globalization, but we will see clusters happening. And when I see the tone and either in Beijing, or look at the warning that the U.S. government, the Biden administration just mentioned about Hong Kong, saying that it's increasingly a risk to operate there. I mean, let's not forget a lot of foreign companies had their headquarters for Asia in Hong Kong, and some even global headquarters there. So what will happen? I think there's a lot of discussions at the corporate, at the board levels right now, with the risk that we will see for the next few years, real fragmentation.
Would you agree to that, Evert?
Yeah, I absolutely agree to that. And of course, we have to also be honest, in a context where we export to China, to US and everywhere, and I don't need to tell you about enormous quarrel we had about taxation between US and Europe about the Boeing Airbus dispute. There's so many things happening at the moment that the topic that, again, that was mentioned by Wilfried Karl about this avoiding single sources, making sure that you have a few legs to stand on. But there's many problems that are, let's say, coming up new with the geopolitical situations, but there's a few other things that are let's say, more standard. Let's look at the chip topic, and yes, that is just because the market is ramping up so fast. This is a little bit more the hardware problems that are not that new. They happened before. The topic that really is a challenge for us is to see how we take this digitalization topic and this everything is digitally connected. Certainly in the Airbus context of safety and security, how we tackle that topic. And I do think that a standard like an ISO standard or an European norm standard on cyber and the way we cyber protect our supplies or our products would be really needed in order to make sure that we get a little bit of at least a basis on this. What we did with GPDR and things like that is we set some standards that are very high, and also external suppliers have to fulfill those standards. And with that, at least we can hopefully get this new risk better under control.
Yeah, that's certainly an important point with the rising connectivity of everything. We kind of need to also raise the IT security standards and the identification tools for automatic or automated communication and everything. These are things that are also a lot discussed with in the context of cloud computing in general, I think, and also within the context of Geierhos and the data spaces, the European data spaces that we'd like to build up, I think. And there comes what I observe is that, for example, the automobile industry, one of their big use cases for such a data space is actually the supply chain, and to be able to have certain criteria fixed and available for every player within that chain. And I'm really curious whether we find some quick new standards there, and it's interesting because the different industrial sectors also come from different standards in a way. So that would be probably also a big challenge in trying to develop these new standards that might finally make the supply chain a little more safe.
And I add one point to this, Susanne,
yeah.
Because the topic about cyber is that it cannot be a standard that we define and then we have 5 years as standard. Thank you very much. That will not work. And if it takes 5 years to define this standard, but what I'm trying to go for is we need an agile standard where, again, the newest informations lead to updating it. It's a little bit what we're doing on the cyber protection, cyber resilience side. It's something that is fluid. You get your upgrade on your applications on a weekly or monthly basis, whatever. We will have to have those standards, kind of like we do the software updates. That standard will have to be updated on a weekly or monthly or even daily basis, if so needed, to make sure that the level of protection and the amount of holes that the cyber hackers and others will find will be covered fast enough. This is really, it's not a regulation and we do it and 5 years later we review it.
But that's a very, very important point, I think, and I would like to ask this to all of you. Do you have a vision on how we realize this? Because we are talking about sectors that are really regulated and where we work with certificates and everything. How do we get these processes so quick and agile? I think Wilfried Karl has an idea. He raised his hand.
Well, I don't know if it's an idea, but I just want to add something here, because that's a very, very important point. We need not only standards, I think we need rules. And especially when it comes to supply chains where we have single sources or nearly single sources. We were talking about chip industry. There might be not very many suppliers for chip production in the world. And I don't know how the geopolitical situation in Asia will look like in 10 years. Now we are getting supplied by Taiwan for most of the chips we use here. Also, you mentioned cloud computing. Many people always try to convince me that we have to do something to copy these big hyperscalers. We have to build up the same here. I think that's not the right way. Wouldn't it be better to put the efforts not in copying big sources that we can use, but in regulating them, setting up standards? We as customers in Europe, these are the standards you as a supplier have to follow if you want to make money here, and setting up some rules when it comes to, for example, using our GDPR or even rules for the physical regional placement of systems. I think we could do a lot more here in that way instead of putting much effort in maybe directions that may not lead to the goal we want them to lead.
Can I quickly react to this, Susanne? Wilfried, I fully agree with you. And it will need lots of years even to develop a hyperscaler. Let's say, even if we wanted to, it would take, I don't know, 10 years to get a chip manufacturer in Europe at the same level of competitiveness and quality. It's not that easy. And I do think that, again, as you say, regulation, and maybe, let's say, when I talked about standards, I was trying to avoid rules because it always sounds a little bit too tough, but probably you're right. But also, I think what we do have to do is we have to kind of create secure architectures, overlays, to make sure that what we are using is following the rules and is doing as they say. So it's a little bit about, I don't want to call it internal controls, but we have to put some overlays to make sure that it's a little bit like compliance. 10,000 people in our company are compliant, and there's 2 bad guys, and then you're still in trouble. And we have to make sure that when we do those architectures and use all those guys that promise to be honest, to keep them on the honest track.
Thank you. André, you have a thought on this?
Yes, I would like to go. I think all this makes a lot of sense. I would like to go even further than Wilfried. I think we need yes to be less naive. We made a proposal a couple of weeks ago, which was received a bit. That in some areas we should. I mean, why do we consider that European airlines, and Evert knows that well, in many cases still needs to have majority control by European players, and we don't do that in some absolutely strategic areas like cloud. So I mean, hyperscalers, what I understand, are putting $1 billion per month, the 3 biggest ones, for the infrastructure. It's impossible to catch up. Just thinking, what I hear sometimes a bit from especially European levels is, oh, we lost the 3rd wave, but we will win the 4th wave. First, I want to know what we're doing differently that we don't lose the 4th wave. And we probably need to, so regulation is important, probably being a little bit tough. I mean, yes, the Chinese did it. They imposed joint ventures. Why don't we impose that? And I know it's a bit provocative, that when Amazon does business in Germany, fine, but Amazon Germany should be 50%, 51% German investors. And we have so much money that we accumulated in the last 12 months that we can pay even Bezos. So it's a bit tough, but otherwise we will always run. And the second thing I wanted to say is what Evert said about hardware. The interesting thing is that there's this merging between hardware and software. I mean, look at Tesla. Is Tesla hardware or software? It's actually both. The fact that Pegasus happened to the OS apparently issue, and that it's fixed to an update, needs to make us think that we need to have this permanent assessment. Otherwise, the risk is that at the given time we have the perfect certified hardware, but you just need a new plugin or a new update, and the leak is in our system. And the last point, if you allow me, how do we combine that with double sourcing? I think that's probably also an opportunity. My point is always worried when I hear that we should only buy European, because I think it's going to cut off from innovation on the other side. So could we maybe think about the Buy European Act, where you have an obligation to have several sources, among which at least one European. And that could bring smaller companies and newcomers that probably don't have the chance in the run. Maybe this is a middle way that could be explored.
Very interesting thought. Michael Vetter wanted to add.
Yeah, probably I would like to add two viewpoints on this. And André, thank you very much for stating that we have to become more tough. I guess it's important for us to be tough and more consequent in creating a level playing field. And as you said, if you want to make business with European companies or German companies, then you also have to put a footprint to build up a footprint in Europe or in Germany. And this must be mandatory. This goes to intellectual property rights. And there, I guess we really are in a good position to be tougher because we are still economically strong as the European Union. We have a strong civil society, which need to raise their voice in this regard. And we are also very good in regulation, and I don't mean bureaucracy, but really regulate things in a way that they must be regulated. For industry, and this is my observation with regard to the defense industry, they must be aware that they also have to look for new operating models. I always tell our platform manufacturers, so the guys who build the aircraft, the ships, and the tanks, that the tank is not only a mobile land system with a turret and a gun, but it's a data center where a land system is built around. The same is true for an aircraft. And the most impressive part is a modern frigate, which is a data center with a swimming data center, which integrates sensors, effectors, communication systems, supporting systems, and they also have to translate those new operating models, like André put the Tesla example, its hardware and software and its mobility. As such, they also have to integrate these new operating models into their thinking and their calculation. So it's not so much at getting the next aircraft, but it's getting the next flying system that could integrate sensors, effectors, and create effects. And if we are strong in this part, if we are more agile on this road, and if we create the level playing field with our industrial partners across the world, I guess we're on a pretty well path into the future.
I think that's also a very important point when you say that the suppliers have to take that into account, that they might have to change their operating models. What does that mean for you when you you procure things, and what does that mean for those who buy? Do they also have to work different or think differently?
Absolutely. When I use our system, we are currently also in the system change. We have changed our operating model with regard to the procurement of IT. So now, in the good old times, we procured IT like a tank. So we wrote down the requirements, and then somebody said, okay, this is how we fulfill the requirement. And then after 20 years, you got a solution which was 18 years outdated, which was far too expensive, and which wasn't connected to anything else in the world. And this is no longer sustainable. So now what we are advocating is building the platforms, standardize your equipment. If you have those standards, be quick and scale up, and this will be the future operating model. And those standards will also be mandatory for the future combat cloud in a future combat air system, or for the cloud environment in a future land-based system, or a sea-based, maritime-based system. So we have to increase our efforts in standardization, make use of the agility, especially in the civilian IT market, which is far more agile than the classic military industry will ever be, and force the industry to look at their operating model so that they hopefully sometime will keep up with the speed that we are gaining now. So we also have to adapt. This is not a blame game. So if we stick to our old processes, we will certainly fail.
I think we can certainly state that all players in this game have to speed up as technology develops so fast, and also the situation, all the factors around the technology change quite quickly. Michaela, maybe from your scientific point of view, we heard some thoughts now on on new standards or the new processes around agreed standards, but also maybe not even only standards, but new rules. What do you think? What would help to make the supply chains resilient in a way that we feel in Europe that will be adequate?
I think we need a kind of framework. I think two aspects weren't mentioned yet. We were talking about footprints, but not about the environmental footprints. And the other aspect is transparency. So if we have this sustainable mindset, which is usually passed down to the supply chain and its parts suppliers, they have also to tell us in a way, how is it manufactured, where is it manufactured, what components are used, and so on. That's transparency. We see it today in our today's life that customers want to know where the milk is from. In a simple example, that's in a greater scenario that if we are manufacturing things and using things and building software and hardware together, there needs to be standards how we can transfer these things by keeping IP issues. And of course, you mentioned fragmentation. So we have limitations because there was the North Korean example mentioned. So we have countries or companies where we can't work together. So this technical supply chain digitalization is a combination of a modeling phase. It's a combination of security and safety aspects, and of course of let it call me intelligent model to predict how we can configure these supply chains analytics resilient to issues like for example, you mentioned the tsunami, you mentioned geopolitical situations, so that we can face these issues more flexible than we can do it now. And I think it's not a long way to come there, but I'm a little unsure if we will get it in, like we call it in software development, in a more flexible way than a waterfall model, that we do it stepwise, because in the EU and in Germany, we are like a big tank. So we write a paper, we write another white paper, and we have some issues. What are the advantages, the disadvantages? And before we have something done which is really law and regularized, like you mentioned that we want to have a participant from a European country and a company or supply chain which is working in Europe. I think these 5 years which were mentioned during this discussion, that's the same problem as General Vetter mentioned. If we have done these law things, then we are outdated. And with, I think the bigger problem than the technology aspects are the regulation aspects. So we need policymakers who get it faster. We've seen it now in the COVID situation. We are able to work faster than normal standards. And for this, I think we should also find another way to improve our work situation, that we can build everything which is possible now.
Thank you. I would now like to ask you two questions that came from the audience. One is, wouldn't it be good to get companies like TSMC or Samsung to produce their high-end chips in Germany or Europe, even if we had to highly subsidize the production, just to be safe in case that the political situation with China escalates? Who wants to answer that one? Yeah, André?
Yeah, just one point, not on TSMC, because that's not the case, unfortunately, yet. It's happening in the US. But look at what's happening with Intel. The CEO of Intel is currently on a roadshow in Europe. And my question is whether we will have the traditional red carpet in Paris, Berlin, Copenhagen, who gets the plant. And if that's the case, we will be able to extract very little and pay very high. I heard about amounts like 6 or 8 billion euro out of, I think, 10 or 12 billion investment. I'm not 100% sure of it. And we're talking about 10 nanometer. We're not even talking about the best in class, which is rather 2 or 3 currently. Or are we able to go beyond, and it's important, the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 jobs, but in a big picture, that's not what matters. And really use the leverage. And I don't want to single Intel here, and for the moment, let me say that I'm neutrally confident that we will have this integrated approach, because otherwise Europe will be again a big supermarket where the subsidization game is in full play, and we have 750 billion to spend, so why not?
Thank you. And then we have another question from Mr. Langlois, asking, some of you propose a kind of Buy EU Act similar to Buy American Act and to the Chinese approach, but there are still a lot of EU countries against such regulation. Do you think that the current situation could make them change their mind? Well, that's a guess. Yeah, Wilfried, Karl.
Well, I don't know whether the situation may change the mind of these people. Maybe a little bit, because the pandemic situation or the discussion about 5G was quite widespread. But what I want to say is that I think we don't need a Buy EU Act. We need a framework where we say, okay, what kind of technology or methods is so important that we need to keep the knowledge in Europe, and then this should be part of the criteria of the procurement process. So we don't need to put a Buy only EU on top of that, but I think we shouldn't put a label digital sovereignty on certain topics, and then it should be part of the procurement process. And I think then naturally it will be more an EU suppliers dealing with that procurements.
Evert?
Yeah, maybe I would like to support what Wilfried Karl said. We need to really select where we want to be independent. We need to really be, let's say, we should not do Buy European Act on all, but we need to really, let's say, be aware where we want to be independent, and that can be on topics like medicines or I don't know, masks in the future, I don't know, but also clearly on digital independence. And I'd also like to pick up on one point of André, and I really agree. If we were one Europe, we would not ask and invest in Intel, just as an example again, and to get them to bring the old technology to the one that gives the best subvention. But we would say as Europe, come on guys, get your act together. Yes, we'll put in the billion or the 2 or the 5, but not for the old technology, but for the new technology. And that Europe could do, because I fully agree, the buy market and the strengths, but we would have to be one Europe to make that happen.
Michaela?
Maybe just one sentence. I'm also not in favor of a Buy European Act, which would result, to my personal point of view, that both industry and academia would get lazy because they know they will get the tender, and that's fine. So that's probably not a good idea innovation-wise. But we must become more attractive. And I guess there are a couple of things that we have to put into our favor. We have a trained workforce. We have overall a good infrastructure in Europe. We have a positive climate. We have a civil society which is up to speed, and probably we should advocate those comparative advantages that we have even louder, and then it will be probably a good idea to settle down in Europe, to build up capabilities in Europe, and then to team up with Europe.
Great.
Okay, we are coming towards the end of our panel. We've got 3 minutes left. So I had wanted to ask you, what are your 3 guiding ideas of how to build supply chain resilience in the future? But I think we have already discussed a lot of these ideas, but maybe in a very short round, what is the most important aspect we have to deal with as quickly as possible to reach more supply chain resilience as quickly as possible? So maybe we start with Wilfried.
So as quickly as possible, in one sentence, I think we should always question the trade-off between supply chain efficiency and the risks. And we have to do that repeatedly because our criteria may change from time to time.
Then we have Evert.
Yeah, the topic about agile standard or agile rules with daily, weekly, monthly updates regarding digital and cyber resilience, we should really push for that.
Thank you. Michaela?
My advice would be really to increase transparency, to have a sound risk management, and to use the good developments that Michaela is providing us with AI in support of supply chain transparency. Thank you.
So Michaela, next.
Thanks. I think we need more flexibility in our supply chains and, as Michael Vetter mentioned, more transparency. Thanks.
Thank you. And André. So
how can I add anything? Everything has been said. I would add to the word flexibility that was mentioned many times is to be permanently strategic. Think about our interests, think about what is realistically possible, and adapt to the current situation. And if we are on this way, I think we will make great progress.
And in this sense, we probably need some long-term investments and also strategic decisions as well as some short-term ones. Thank you very much to all of you. It was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I think we could cover at least some of the important aspects that matter in this context. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts. Have a good day.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.